If you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the business of lifelong learning, you're in the right place. I'm Celisa Steele.
And I'm Jeff Cobb, and this is the Leading Learning Podcast. Hey there, we are back with episode 30 of the Leading Learning Podcast, and this time we're actually going to spend a little bit of time looking at podcasting itself as a medium. It's been quite a growing phenomenon, and it's something that we think that just about every organization should be taking a serious look at to potentially include in their learning mix. Before we jump into that, though, I want to just briefly mention that we do have our spring event, Learning Technology Design, or LTD, coming up. If you haven't yet tuned into that, you can get all of the critical information over at ltd.leadinglearning.com. And if you have tuned in and haven't yet made a decision to attend, we'd encourage you to get over there. We do have limited capacity for the event just based on the size of the space that we have available for it. So get over to ltd.leadinglearning.com and check that out. We also want to thank Meridian Knowledge Solutions for being a sponsor of Leading Learning Webinars, and as part of that package, that makes them a sponsor of this episode of the podcast. You can find out more about upcoming webinars at tagoras.com/webinars and about Meridian at meridianks.com. So that's enough for introductory material. We, like I said, want to really jump into talking a little bit about the phenomenon of podcasting in today's episode. And we were kind of spurred to do that actually from listening to a podcast. I'm a regular listener to Marketing Over Coffee, and every year they have somebody from Edison Research come on. They had Tom Webster in a recent episode, and we'll link to that. And Edison is a firm that's probably done more than any other to really track what's going on with podcasting and track its growth. They've actually been doing a survey, a research study they call Infinite Dial since 1998. So they've really accumulated a lot of data, and they have seen quite a bit of growth in podcasting over the years and in this past year.
Yeah, and it's a really buttoned up survey that they do too. They do a telephone survey, and they're looking at folks age 12 and older in the U.S. And like you said, they really have seen a lot of growth in terms of podcasting. So I think the numbers from, well, actually, I don't think I have them in front of me. The numbers from the 2016 report are that 36% of those Americans who are 12 years or older have ever listened to a podcast. So that's an estimated 98 million people.
That's a huge number. And I've been fascinated by the growth, and there are a number of things driving it that that we can talk about here in a minute. But you look at the Edison research, you look at what we know about iTunes. I mean, more than 250,000 people now subscribe to podcasts through iTunes. I think they have a total of more than 1 billion subscriptions at this point. I'm looking at an infographic that's telling me this that we'll also link to that. But I mean, basically a third of Americans listening to podcasts at this point. That's just absolutely tremendous growth. And as you said, this is a buttoned-up survey. I mean, they went out and did calls both with mobile phones and with land-based phones to more than 2,000 people. So this is statistically valid. We know that this is a real phenomenon, that podcasting really is catching on at this point.
Yeah, unless you be a cynic and think, well, that's 36% that have maybe listened to one podcast in their life. I mean, 21% of those interviewed had listened within the last month. So even that more regular listener, that someone who listened within the last month, that's 57 million people. So again, I think there's just no way to get around the fact that there really is there are a lot of podcast listeners at this point.
Yeah, and so I mean, let's talk a little bit about why that might be the case, exactly why we're getting so much growth at this point. And I mean, there are just a number of factors in there. I mean, one is that, podcasts in general are relatively easy to produce and get out there into the world. And we can talk about that a little bit more in a minute as we talk about how organizations might embrace this. But on the consumer side, it's really attractive as a medium, because I mean, you think about it, you can go out there and you can find content that is designed exactly for your particular needs, your interests. You can go out and find a podcast on just about anything. So you get this very, personalized content, and it's also, the type of content that you can use, that you can consume while you're doing, any number of other things. I mean, definitely podcasting, I think, is the perfect fit for our multitasking culture. You don't have to be reading something, you don't have to be watching something. You can be doing just about anything and podcasting at the same time, or listening to a podcast at the same time.
Well, yeah, and I think that podcasts really fulfill that promise of the anytime, anywhere learning because, like you're saying, you can be doing something else. You can be multitasking. You can be out for your jog or your walk. You can be at the gym and listening. You can even be driving in the car if you have a commute or riding on the subway, whatever it is. So I think it really does, like I said, fulfill that promise of the anytime, anywhere vision of learning that's been around for so long.
And of course, part of what makes that possible, I mean, really, almost all of what makes that possible is just about everybody is walking around with a mobile phone at this point. I mean, it used to be, podcasting, I think, got its name originally because you had to have an iPod, to do it. So you had to have this special device and you were downloading things on your computer and then you had to sync it over to your podcast. And a lot of people may not be aware of it. The other 2/3 out there who aren't doing it yet maybe aren't aware of this yet, but you don't have to have an iPod anymore for this. I mean, your mobile phone is your podcast player in most instances, and it's just gotten so much easier to actually get podcasts. There are any number of apps you can have on your phone that are just going to, you can search for podcast on them, and then it's going to instantly update the podcast for you so that, they're automatically updated when you're going to the gym or whatever. You just look and see what's the latest episode, and it's going to, download that to your phone or stream it to your phone. Just make it really, incredibly easy to get the content now. And that was always a challenge in the past, but now, actually getting podcast content is just so darn easy.
And to your point about how podcasting got its name from the iPod and how that process has changed and gotten much easier. I mean, one of the comments that Tom Webster made in that Marketing Over Coffee episode that we will link to in the show notes, I mean, he just makes the point that really the name podcast is anachronistic, at this point, that it really doesn't reflect the current situation. And he prefers the term audio on demand. And I like that. I mean, it's this idea of, again, it emphasizes the fact that it's on demand. You can find it wherever and whenever you would like, and you get to sort of initiate that experience on your own timeline according to your own interests and schedule.
Yeah, I mean, and if you think about, when and where people are going to do this type of thing, I mean, you can probably look at your own life and think about where does podcast make sense. I mean, for me, I always listen to podcasts if I'm working out or taking a walk. It's very popular to just, have your phone along again, put on the headphones and listen to something while you're walking, working out, whatever it is. I mean, how many people are working out every day when you're commuting, when you're in the car? I mean, just about every car that's been sold in the past, 5 to 10 years or so has a USB jack in it, or, one of those eighth inch audio jacks to plug something in, or, these days, Bluetooth. So you can get in a car, and a lot of cars are just going to sync up automatically with your phone, and all you got to do, like you said, it's on demand. I mean, it's practically like just having a new version of radio in your car, but it's radio that you want. I mean, you're picking what you want to listen to as you're driving for your morning commute, or as you're standing on the subway, or whatever the case might be. So, to truly be able to, make the demand and have it met when you want is just, it's there now, and it's something that every organization needs to be thinking about. We've also seen, in the last couple of years too, some really breakout type podcasts that have happened. I mean, a lot of people may not be aware of it, but there's some big names out there, people, who have been on TV and that sort of stuff, who have started podcasts, and have a huge following. But probably the biggest thing to hit, and actually Tom Webster talks about this in the Marketing Over Coffee podcast episode, is what he calls the Serial effect. That podcast series Serial, that's about, tracing a crime that's happened in the past, absolutely captivated people. I mean, it had millions of subscribers, to that podcast, which is just, really a phenomenon.
Have you listened to it, Jeff?
I have yet to listen to that one. To be honest, it's not my personal interest, and we'll talk in a little bit about, some of the podcasts that we personally like, but I have not yet tuned into that, even though I am an absolute podcast hound. I mean, I listen to podcasts all the time.
Yeah, I haven't listened to it either, but, I mean, even though you haven't listened to it and I haven't listened to it, we've both heard about it. I mean,
right,
it's
right.
It is having its cultural impact even for people who haven't actually listened to it.
Yep. Yeah. And so I think, we keep saying that this is something organizations need to be tuning into. I mean, I think in particular, if you're a membership organization, it's important to look at this for a number of reasons. I mean, we've already mentioned some of the benefits, just being able to get to people, anytime, any place, and you may be able to get to particular niches of your audience that you might not reach otherwise. In fact, we know one organization, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, NRECA, they created a podcast because they found out that the CEOs of co-ops would listen to podcasts. That's something they were interested in.
Yeah, and I love the phrase that they used to talk about that they realized that the CEOs had a lot of windshield time, so the podcast was a way, right, to meet them where they were, to meet their learners where they were. Anyway.
So they're getting them in the car, as they're driving. And this is, when you're doing any sort of needs assessment surveys these days, you want to find out, have people actually been listening to podcasts or not, and then do your, demographic slicing and dicing on that and find out who in your membership base does this align with, because that's probably how you're going to want to angle your podcast and the content that you cover in the podcast. So being able to reach new segments, and not to mention broader segments. When a podcast is out there in the public, it can get shared, it can get passed around over time. It can build up a following that may be well beyond the following that you've traditionally had, and that's going to be fertile territory for finding new members, finding new customers for your education and training experiences.
And I think, too, when thinking about a podcast and whether it makes sense for your organization, I think there are two different ways to go about creating a podcast. At one extreme, it can be brand new content, where you're putting out something that you really haven't covered in another format, and you're delivering that via this audio on demand. Another way is to repurpose content that you already have, and maybe take something like, the recordings that you're getting at an annual convention. Maybe that speaker doesn't make use of very many slides, so she might be perfect as a podcast episode. And so I think that there's perhaps some reluctance on the part of organizations to jump in if you feel like you're just going to be having to create yet more content. But I think to really think about the podcast opportunity for repurposing content that you might already have.
Yeah, and we did that in one of our earlier episodes. I can't remember which number, but we'll put it in the show notes presentation I did on pricing at the Leading Learning Symposium, and we ran that as a podcast episode because it worked for that. And as far as getting content for a podcast goes, I mean, there are any number of opportunities. I mean, you can leverage your member expertise, you can leverage your subject matter expertise. In fact, leading up to the Leading Learning Symposium, and we're going to do this for learning technology design as well. In fact, we already have with Brian McGowan and just the last podcast. Where we get them to do a podcast episode in advance of that event, to talk to them for 20 or 30 minutes about what they're going to be covering at the event, and that helps to give a preview. Helps get them warmed up for the event, get them motivated for it. So tapping your subject matter experts, but then also your expert members too. Going out and interviewing some members who are doing interesting things, and we've done that as part of our Leading Learning community. You've heard people like Josh Goldman on the podcast from the Ohio CPAs, and members are often doing incredibly interesting things that other members want to hear about. So you can tap that as a source for content, and simultaneously be helping to build community. And of course, at the same time, you're going to be learning from those members. I mean, you talk about a great method of building your own expertise, doing some market research. I mean, I think one of the ways that I know I personally have benefited from podcasting is, you're conducting these interviews, you learn a ton in the process, both about the content of, the interview, but also just about what people who are engaged with your market, with your environment, are thinking about and how they're thinking about it. And that's absolutely invaluable when you're thinking about what new products are you going to create from an education and training standpoint, or any other standpoint within your organization.
Yeah, I definitely feel like I learn a lot in terms of the preparation, because I do go out and read or research around whatever topic or organization we're going to be speaking to. So I learn a lot in the preparation and learn a lot during the conversation. And then one of the things that we do afterwards in production is we make sure to produce show notes as well. And I think that again, sort of further strengthens the takeaways for me personally, but then also hopefully too is a benefit to listeners. And I know you're a big fan of show notes, Jeff.
I am, and that might be a great segue into talking about how podcasts can be effective for learning. Because a lot of people will say, well, it's nice to listen to, but we all know that if you just listen to something, you don't necessarily retain it. So maybe it's not the greatest medium for learning. And I think at a certain level, that's true. I think in most cases, podcasts aren't going to be what you're going to use for really focused and intensive learning experiences where people really have to master something. But in situations where you need to be providing information, where you need to be repeating certain themes or certain types of information over time to for them to sink in, for people to get the nuances of them, podcasting can be really, really powerful for that. And it can also, it can provide a doorway into learning experiences. I mean, we already talked about using subject matter experts to kind of tee up what's going to be going on in an event. You can use that, relative to any learning experience, courses, webinars, whatever, to help kind of open the doorway into your portfolio, into your catalog of content offerings. Or a podcast can serve as, supplemental content. So maybe you've delivered a course, maybe you've delivered an event, and you want to provide some bonus content, some content to help with reinforcement over time, and podcasting can be great for that.
I also do think that you can use podcasts for true learning. I think there's something beautiful in the schedule that's behind many podcast shows, and so I think that there's a way you can leverage that if it's appropriate to the content. I can imagine concluding, an episode with, okay, here's what you need to be thinking about or doing, between now and when the next episode is going to be released. And, it builds in this automatic sort of time frame and schedule along which to then conduct that assignment or that research or whatever it is that you're asking learners to do. So I think that the medium is flexible enough to allow for learning as well as some of the more kind of content marketing aspects.
Yeah, definitely. And you started out talking about show notes. I mean, show notes are a great way to make it possible for somebody who's been listening to then, not have to go back and rewind and try to find that one place in the podcast. If you're doing good show notes, and we do those for these episodes, you can find the show notes for this one at leadinglearning.com/episode 30. And those show notes are going to give you a blow-by-blow of the most important content that's been covered in that episode. So it gives you some prompts to review with, and then if there are any to-dos that come out of it, or if there are any resources that come out of it for you to review. In fact, we'll have links to, for instance, the Edison study to go along with this podcast. Those sorts of things can be put into the show notes. So somebody who is a driven, self-directed learner is going to be able to use both the podcast audio and the accompanying show notes as a nice little learning package. And you can make that more or less formal, more or less structured, just depending on what your goals are with your organization's learning activities.
And another practice that might fall into that best practices realm is just to make it easy to share, so that it can become this social learning object or something that gets discussed and passed around. Particularly if you're trying to use it for from a content marketing standpoint, you really want that shareability to be there.
Yeah, definitely. It becomes that social learning object. And, over time, I think a podcast within a particular field can really have significant impact, significant influence. And this might be a good place to start segueing into some of our favorite podcasts, because we started out saying that it was listening to a Marketing Over Coffee podcast that sort of prompted us. We've had this podcast in mind for a while, but this sort of got us off the block and said, okay, let's finally do this. And so I was listening to Christopher Penn talk about the podcasting phenomenon on the Marketing Over Coffee, Christopher Penn and John Wall. And I've been listening to those guys. I don't know how long they've had that podcast going. I mean, they've got hundreds of episodes of it. And I think they really have had a significant influence on the field of marketing, just because they have been doing that so persistently for so long. And they've started to, kind of change perceptions with how they come at marketing and what, people are thinking about, so that they're a real influence in that field now, which I think is very powerful. Marketing Over Coffee has probably been the podcast that I've listened to, most consistently over time. I've kind of cycled through a bunch of others and sometimes keep listening to them, sometimes don't. And I can talk about some of my other favorite ones. But I mean, what are some of your favorite podcasts?
I think I have 4 podcasts that I listen to, not somewhat regularly. They're the ones that I make sure that I'm caught up on. And in addition to those 4, I do a lot of kind of more browsing. Someone will, tell me about a particular podcast or a podcast episode. I'll go and check it out. But there are 4 that I listen to very regularly. One is On Being, which is an NPR show, but you can catch it as a podcast. And there are a couple of things that I really like about that. I mean, one thing is just how they talk about it. I mean, they say that On Being is a social enterprise with a radio show at its heart.
That's nice.
So I think it gets back to this idea of, a podcast or audio on demand, whatever term you want to use, is a medium, and it's a means to an end. You don't want to be podcasting just to podcasting. You need to have a message and a vision for what it is, how you're going to use the podcast. And I think they have a very clear vision. But it's a wonderful broad vision for what they do. I mean, they say that they look at the questions that animate the center of human life. So what does it mean to be human, and how do we want to live? And Krista Tippett, who does these interviews, so she interviews everybody from poets to physicists to religious scholars, and it's just, for me, it's a very refreshing and interesting multitude of perspectives on these really, central questions to what it means to be human.
Yeah, I like that. And Krista Tippett does a great job with that podcast. I think I've listened to that one many times.
And then the other 3 that I listen to regularly are all from the Poetry Foundation. It's the Poetry Magazine podcast, so that's monthly, about an hour. So every time they release a new issue of Poetry Magazine, they put out a podcast to go with it. So they usually have 1 or 2 poets reading some of their poems that are in that issue. They'll also have the editors talking about some of the poems, and a little bit of just kind of behind the scenes content about the poems in the issue, and I really like that.
And that's a great model too. I mean, if your organization is publishing a journal or a magazine or something of that sort, that's a fantastic thing to do along with it.
And then sort of at the other extreme, they have a Poem of the Day podcast. So it's a daily as opposed to the monthly Poetry Magazine podcast. They do a poem a day. Most of those are around the 2-minute length, so that's the kind of thing where you can it's very easy to get in at least one poem every day because it's very short. And then they have Poetry Off the Shelf, which kind of falls in between. It comes out multiple times a month, maybe like twice a month, but it's not on a very predictable schedule, whereas the other ones are much more predictable. And that's just kind of in a shorter, more like a 30-minute range. So I think it's very interesting that they have kind of the different timing of it and the different lengths of it. And so I also think that if you're considering multiple podcasts, if that makes sense for your organization, kind of thinking about the different ways it can be using, that very micro level of a single poem, is there some tip that you could, give your listeners on a daily basis that would just take, a minute or 2? That might be an interesting approach to a podcast.
Yeah, I like that, and that's great to kind of highlight some different models that people are using because they're organizations are using, because I mean you really can use podcasts in a lot of different ways, and I'm very promiscuous when it comes to podcasts. If you look at my phone, I mean, I'm subscribed to dozens and dozens. And what I'll do is I'll rifle through them and I'll look kind of episode by episode. There are very few podcast series where I will listen to every single one of them. I just look at what's good each week and pick something out. But I'll highlight a few more in addition to Marketing Over Coffee. I mean, Marketing Over Coffee, I should say, was very much an inspiration for this podcast because it's Chris Penn and John Wall on a weekly basis, sitting down and talking to each other, interspersed occasionally with interviews, which is exactly our model for this podcast. So they're very much in the back of our minds. But some other ones I'll mention. Tim Ferriss, who is famous for the 4-Hour Work Week, has a podcast, and he's gone all in with podcasting. And I want to mention him because I think he's a fascinating guy, and he is sort of the consummate lifelong learner. He's always experimenting, always doing just in some cases just strange stuff that he talks about. But the thing I find fascinating about his podcast is sometimes his episodes are 2 to 3 hours hours long.
Well, it's like most of his work week right there.
There you go. Yeah. And the common wisdom on podcasts is they need to be, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. They need to be short, which is certainly what most podcasts are. He sort of throws that to the wind. And, I have to say, I certainly will not listen to all of his episodes because I just don't have that amount of time. But he is a good interviewer and he's an interesting guy and he can talk for 2 or 3 hours and people listen to it. I mean, the podcast is really, really popular. So don't think, that you have to be short. You may put out a monthly podcast. I mean, he does this every week, but, you may put out a monthly podcast and it's a longer podcast. Don't assume that it has to be short form content. Long form content is making a comeback in a lot of arenas.
Well, that reminds me, in that Infinite Dial report, the 2016 report that's just out, I mean, they talk about how on-demand audio kind of smashed the attention span myth, and I think the Tim Ferriss long format podcast episodes is a prime example of that.
Yeah, and you got to remember you can start and stop these things. I mean, I never sit down and listen to 3 hours of Tim Ferriss talking with somebody, but I might listen to 15 minutes here and then pick it up and do another 20 minutes later. And over time, I'll listen to all or most of what's being said. A couple of others I'll highlight. I'm a closet songwriter, and I've got a couple of songwriting type podcasts I listen to. One is called Soda Jerker on songwriting, and another one is called Song Exploder. And I like both of these. Really dig into the process of how something is done. One is more interview oriented. One really dissects songs and sort of takes it apart and does a little bit of interviewing. But I think in terms of a model, going to whether it's your members, your customers, your subject matter experts, finding a particular issue or topic and really doing sort of a dissection of it in a podcast. I think that's very powerful, and that's something people are looking for. I mean, we kind of did that with Flipped Learning when we talked with Brian McGowan recently, and also in the Digital Badges podcast that we did with Digital Promise. So that can be very compelling. And the last thing I'll mention is, sometimes I'll tune into basically limited series podcasts. And Seth Godin, who's sort of the marketing guru, who's published tons of books, has a huge following. He's done one on entrepreneurship that we'll link to. I can't remember exactly what that's called, but I think it's about a 15-part series, and it's him sort of conducting this workshop, I think just in the course of a day or two, but they've chunked that up into segments and turned it into a podcast that you can subscribe to and listen to. And I did pretty much the same thing with Leading the Learning Revolution. I did a series of 21 podcasts. I actually started out thinking that was going to be an ongoing series and finally realized at some point that this needs to be finite, and I just sort of tied a bow around it and said this is what goes with the book. So it can be, podcast can be something that's, is a certain number of episodes that supports a particular product or a particular event, and then it's over, and that's fine. You don't have to keep going forever.
And the Poetry Foundation has one that fits that model. I mean, they had an Essential American Poets podcast, and it was all based on the selection of then U.S. Poet Laureate Donald Hall, who sort of identified these are kind of the essential American poets. So they recorded or pulled together audio of those poets and their poems, and then once you run through all of those poets that he identified, it's over. So, I mean, I think the idea, too, of a time-limited approach can make beautiful sense.
So, that's a number of different models we've just covered there. And, you can review this again in the show notes for this episode. We'll make sure that this is kind of captured there. Again, it'll be leadinglearning.com/episode 30 where the show notes are. But, before we turn this into a long-form model podcast, though, maybe we'll start winding down, since we usually do try to stick closer to that 30-minute mark in what we do. As we're exiting here, I've already mentioned, where you can find the show notes. When you do go to leadinglearning.com/episode 30 to look at those show notes and check out other episodes of the podcast, make sure you also check out the options that we have for subscribing to the podcast. That's very easy to do. You can do it through iTunes. We've already mentioned earlier in this podcast that there are a number of great, what are basically called podcatchers out there, apps that you can have on your phone. Stitcher Radio is one. I use one called Instacast. There are a number of others, though, and we suggest some of those on the site as well. Or you can just subscribe to the RSS feed and have it, come in through a web browser, basically. So, a number of ways to subscribe, and we'd be truly grateful if you would subscribe to the Leading Learning Podcast.
We'd also be grateful if you would take just a minute and give us a rating on iTunes. You can do that by going to leadinglearning.com/iTunes. We really do appreciate it, and it makes it a lot easier for others to find this podcast, and it makes us feel good to hear from you.
And as we've already mentioned, there are more than 250,000 podcasts on iTunes. So making sure the ones that are valuable bubble up and that you're able to find the ones that you really want. The ratings there really are important for that. So please do take a minute to do that. Don't assume somebody else will do it. You are the person who needs to do it, dear listener. Finally, we'd like for you to consider telling others about the podcast. We mentioned earlier that podcasts can be a social learning object. Certainly, if you have colleagues within your organization or at other organizations who you think would find this valuable, just go down the hall or pick up the phone and tell them about it. But if you want to do the social media thing, you can send out a tweet simply by going to leadinglearning.com/share. Or if that isn't your thing, you can pick another social network of your preference and either use the text that we do in that Automagic tweet or make up some text of your own and share a little love about the Leading Learning podcast.
Also, just wanted to remind you again that we have LTD, which is Learning Technology Design, coming up on May 18th and 19th in Arlington. You can find out more at ltd.leadinglearning.com. One thing I will mention is that we will have a content pod there around podcasting. Tadu Yimam from
the National Association of College and University Business Officers,
yes.
It is NACUBO.
We'll be there doing that. So if you're considering getting into podcasting with your organization, she'll be there to help provide an example of how they're making use of it at their organization, how they're even making money with it.
Definitely. And finally, we do want to say a final thanks to Meridian Knowledge Solutions for being a sponsor of our webinars and by extension of this podcast. You can find out more about them at meridianks.com. And I'll also mention that in the show notes, again, we'll come back to those show notes, we'll provide some links to various posts that will give you tips on how to actually produce a podcast. We will tell you that here at Leading Learning Central, we are not a big production facility. We have our laptop, we have a couple assembled microphones, and we use GarageBand as our editing tool, Libsyn as our hosting service, and it costs us next to nothing to do this. But week in and week out, you get all this great value from the Leading Learning podcast.
So thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Leading Learning Podcast.